throughout Russia and now in Kyrgyzstan and in Ukraine. It is amazing to see how God is using our simple efforts to bring people to Christ. There is still a great hunger for truth and for real relationship with God.
That's the voice of Victor Akhterov introducing this week's First Person program. Welcome, I'm Wayne Shepherd. Victor is the Russian Ministries Director for the Far East Broadcasting Company, and you'll hear his story in just a moment. First, please join us online, either on our webpage, which is firstpersoninterview.com, where you'll find a link to the Far East Broadcasting Company, or on our Facebook page, facebook.com/firstpersoninterview. Well, to say the least, these are challenging days for ministry in the countries of the former Soviet Union. Just recently in Russia, for example, a new law has been passed restricting missionary activity and making it more difficult to share the gospel with people. Also in Russia, FEBC's radio licenses for its AM stations in Moscow and St. Petersburg were revoked. Thankfully, the Internet is still open to FEBC programs. Just before these recent restrictions, I talked with Victor about his vision for reaching millions with the gospel, but we started by talking about his own story.
Well, I remember when I was 10 years old and they suggested, I actually was a good student. It's hard to believe, but I was.
No, I believe that.
And I was one of the first kids in class to be chosen to become a pioneer, a young communist.
Yeah, pioneer was the indoctrination of children into communism, right?
Yes.
Okay.
And I came to my father and I said, Dad, what should I do? He said, you can do whatever you want. You're still young. You don't have to take a stand. But, they're atheists. And if you want to be associated with them, for a while, it's going to be fine. I'll still, love you and support you. If you want to take a stand, I'll be with you. So I was actually crying for most of the night, trying to make that decision. But in the morning, I was strong enough to say before my class that I'm a Christian, I'm a believer, and I'm not going to join the pioneers. So
were you all alone? Was there anyone else in the class who took that stand?
Of course, I was all alone. I was all alone in the whole school, which was about 1,000 people. And that school next door to us did not have any Christians. So I was alone. And it was kind of character forming to take this stand when you're 10 years old. And of course, my dad was there for me, and he was wise enough to give me enough freedom and still guide me and help me. So that was great. And of course, when I was 15 years old, he was imprisoned, and he was imprisoned for the second time. And the first time they just built a little church, and five of them were imprisoned because of that.
Simply because they started a church.
Yes. And that was during Khrushchev times. I wasn't even around yet. And then the second time he was also in prison because he was very active, very outspoken. He was well educated, and at that time not too many people in Russian or Ukrainian church had higher education. He was one of those people, and I think that was one of the reasons why authorities kind of had did want to put him in prison.
They had it in for him, didn't they?
Yes, and I remember, we'll never forget how my mom and me, we went to visit him. He was in Siberia, and we were in eastern Ukraine. It took us maybe a couple days to get to him. And then we had these 2 hours to spend with my dad. And we came into the prison. It's a special political prison. And you are in this small room, and out of the window you can see prisoners walking by, and many of them are just saying hello to us. And some of the best people in Russia were kept in that prison. And then some of them are saying hello to us in a Christian kind of way. They're just saying greetings to you. And I talk to my dad and I say, weren't you the only believer in this political prison? And he says, yeah, about 6 months ago I was the only believer, but the Lord has been working, and he starts me giving story after story of those people becoming believers. And I, when I sit there and I look at my dad and I said, Dad, you know what, I'll never be able to beat that. As though it's a kind of competition, how many people you lead to Christ. Right. And that was my passion, to lead 3 people to Christ in my lifetime. And I think for a teenager, it's not a bad dream, actually. So, I say, Dad, you're here in the middle of nowhere in Siberia. And God is using you to bring those people to Christ. And I said, I'll never be able to achieve anything like that. And my father looked at me and said, and he never does this kind of stuff. And he looked at me and said, Victor, pretty soon you'll be preaching the gospel to thousands of people. Thousands of people.
He saw that ahead for your life.
Somehow he did,
But that had to seem just like the most impossible thing in the world to you.
Absolutely, yeah. I actually laughed and I said, yeah, sure, Dad. But he added one thing. He said, you know what, before it goes to your head, son, you'll be doing this as part of the body of Christ. You're not going to be doing this alone. And 7 years later, I was sitting behind a microphone, actually here in this studio where we sit right now.
This very studio.
This very studio. And this window was closed. And when you're alone in the studio, you don't see anybody, you don't know what to do. I had no training whatsoever. I was 20-something year old. And when you have no training, no education for it, you just have a passion. And then thousands of people start to respond to your programs. You understand very well this is not you doing something special. Yeah. This is God.
This is a lot bigger than you.
Through you, and so many people who are praying for you. And we, whenever I talk to our broadcasters, this is exactly what they feel. That you just open up for the Holy Spirit and He uses you.
So your father's vision came true, in the sense that you do preach to thousands of people.
It did.
Have seen people come to Christ, but through radio.
Through radio, yeah. And who knew, growing up, of course, we listened to the radio. It was our connection to the bigger kind of church of Jesus Christ, because, when you have a small church and you go to the service, you don't go to a house of prayer, you go to the forest because you're trying to hide from the police.
So you're listening to the radio?
We were growing up. We were listening to the radio, yeah. And that was our connection to the church at large, because our church was very small, and we would gather in forest and in houses, and nobody knew where the next service and when it's gonna be. So and then the police would come, and we would run away from the police. It's exciting as teenagers,
That's just is such a foreign idea to us that you were chased like that. Tell me more about your dad, though. What happened to him?
Well, he spent 5.5 years in that prison, and then I was at the army at the time when he was released, but he was suddenly released by Gorbachev. Of course, perestroika came to Russia, and the country was changing. I'll never forget how my commander in the army ran to me and said, "Here, I got a telegram. Your father is free. Our country is changing."
My goodness!
It was very, very exciting time at that time.
Did you believe it to begin with?
I was shocked. And then, of course, after that, my mom told me the story how she was just at night asleep, and she says, there's this weird dream. A big, nice dog comes to me. She said, and then I wake up. I hear someone knocking at the door, and here's your father there. And he traveled from Siberia to Ukraine in his prison clothing. And police knew that all those political prisoners were free, so nobody stopped him. And generally, 1990s was a very, very exciting time and difficult time for Russia, but very exciting. And many people came to know Christ because country just was wide open.
Yeah. I remember those days, but I actually traveled not to Ukraine, but into Moscow and points beyond during the early 1990s and saw some of that enthusiasm and openness for the gospel, which we knew wouldn't last real long because all the bad Western influences came to bear on the country as well. So,
yeah. And nobody knew how history would turn, but I still travel throughout Siberia, throughout Russia, and I meet those people who listen to our broadcasts from Saipan, from the Philippines, and became Christians. Now they're pastoring churches now. They're leaders in the church, and it's wonderful and exciting to see that.
So your father was able to freely preach the gospel after being released?
He was, yeah. And after that, I said, Dad, what do you think? Why were you sent? Why God allowed you to be in that prison? And he said, you know what? I would never be able to preach the gospel to so many highly educated people, so influential people who later became, some of them became leaders of their countries, like Estonia, and some of them went to Israel and held high positions there, and they were influenced by my dad. And he said, I would never be able to reach so many people like that if not for being in that prison.
Yeah, and your father is with the Lord now?
He's with the Lord now, yeah. Somebody the other day just asked me, is your father dead? And I said, he's probably more alive than
now.
We are. Yeah,
I've heard that before.
Yeah, and then I think that's the case. We are not just saying that. This is the reality of our life.
Absolutely. You must give thanks to God, though, for those godly parents who held fast during that time.
Yeah. Not to say that life was easy, and they had 6 children. My father, when he was not in prison, he was working hard, and when I was sitting next to his bed when he was dying, we had this wonderful long conversation, and I asked him, Dad, what was the most difficult time that you experienced in life? And I thought he would share some of those prison experiences. At times he was locked in a small room where you can just stand and the door is right in front of your face. And he stood there for 8 hours at one time. And he said that people go mad, go crazy in 3 hours because you cannot move, you cannot do anything. And he said, God just gave me his grace to be strong in there. But he said that was not the most difficult time. The most difficult time, he said, when he went to Moscow and the KGB allowed him, he was a scientist, a physicist, and they allowed him to work for several months in one of the best labs in Moscow, in the Soviet Union, and he made several breakthroughs in science in those few months. And then later on, they called him in and said, so you want to continue to work here in Moscow, bring your family here, continue to do your research. You have 5 assistants who have PhD degrees in physics, or you can go back to Ukraine. And he said, well, what should I do to stay here in Moscow? That was a passion of his life. And they said, well, just sign this paper. Just you can continue to believe in your God, but you should be a communist if you want to work like that. And my dad told me, going back to Ukraine from Moscow on a train, that was the most difficult journey in my life because I was saying no to my dream. I was burying my dream. And he said, never felt sorry for that, but it was very, very difficult.
We'll continue today's conversation with Viktor Akhterov of the Far East Broadcasting Company coming up on First Person.
This is Ed Cannon, president of the Far East Broadcasting Company. As you listen to this week's edition of First Person, can I remind you to take a moment and visit the webpage firstpersoninterview.com? Click on the FEBC banner there and you'll hear stories of God at work in the lives of people touched by the programs produced by our dedicated staff. We take Christ to the world through radio and new technology. For more, go to firstpersoninterview.com and click on the banner for FEBC.
My guest is Viktor Akhterov. We have known each other for a few years now, and Viktor is director of Russian ministries at Far East Broadcasting Company, and I've traveled with Viktor a little bit in some countries, including Russia. And Viktor, it's a great joy to have you on the program here with me today. How inspiring to hear about your parents and your father holding fast to his faith during the difficult days of Soviet communism, and how you kept your family together and he passed his faith along to you
yes.
children.
Yes.
And tell me about your family now. You live in the U.S., as your sister does, because I know she's in the office studio next door to us here. Where's everybody else?
Our whole family is in the U.S., and we have two wonderful children who, of course, speak good Russian, let me say it by faith. But of course, I travel to Russia and Ukraine all the time.
Right.
I'm there. I just came from going to Russia, Ukraine, and Latvia, where I used to live. It used to be one big country, you know.
Yeah.
It didn't matter where you lived. But it is wonderful to see what God is doing today.
Yeah. I want to talk about your radio ministry today. I was able to travel to Ukraine over a year ago now, and to go to the town where you grew up. And you said... Now, this town was the scene of a lot of fighting during the Russian invasion of
that's
Ukraine.
Where it started, yeah.
And in Slaviansk. I'm not sure how you pronounce it. That's how I pronounce it. But tell me this story about going to the place where some young men were martyred. And tell me that story.
Yeah, I was there just a few days ago and got some new details. I met with the widows of some of our volunteers. One of our volunteers, his name is also Victor, was just this joyful guy. He would come every Monday to the station. We have a station there. God somehow allowed us to open a station in that city of Slaviansk a year before this.
I got to visit the studios there.
Yeah,
it's marvelous.
It is marvelous, yeah. And then of course it is a very difficult post-war time in Slaviansk. And I was talking to Natalia, wife of Victor, and then we went together to the place where they were held, and we came to this house, and this is a former KGB house. This is exactly in the building where my father was held when he was in prison. So
years before, your father was taken to the same house and beaten?
I'm not sure about that. I know that our brothers today were beaten, and they were. They just told me from the witnesses, and they held them together in a small cage, maybe a couple meters wide. 4 of them. They used Scotch tape to cover their eyes, and they were just beating them and breaking their bones. And
but how strange for you to go back to the same building where your father had been held.
I know. Too many waves of emotions, and the witnesses were telling us that those brothers of yours were singing Christian hymns as they were being killed. And when we talk about the past, the Soviet times, the difficulties there, and this is happening today.
Right.
It can happen to. They never expected that this would happen. Of course, to them, they lived a normal, quote unquote, normal life, and then this thing happened, and then you have to answer. And this is the kind of people that I have a privilege to work with, to minister with, and for me it's so humbling to even be associated with guys like this.
So that radio station in Slaviansk, Ukraine was destroyed during the fighting. It's now back on the air?
It is back on the air. And we, of course, the whole tower was destroyed. And we just used a little water tower that's standing on that mountain and put our antenna up.
I heard about
there.
climbing up on the water tower to put the antenna up there.
Yeah. I was there with probably one of the best saxophone players in Ukraine, and we went to that tower and he played Amazing Grace. I'll send you a video.
I'd like
clip.
to hear that. Yeah, I'd like to see that.
And it is amazing what God is doing.
Yeah. But the Far East Broadcasting Company and your role at FEBC extends beyond Ukraine. I mean, it's what you tell me. What is the scope of the Russian Ministry Department?
Well, of course, the Russian Ministries is, first of all, is about Russia. In Ukraine, we're just beginning our ministry. In Russia, we have stations in Moscow, which is about 15 million people, and St. Petersburg. Those are the 2 capitals of Russia. And like in St. Petersburg alone, we have about 250,000 listeners, which is more than I think any station here in the U.S.
Yeah, that's a tremendous audience size there.
Yes, and that's only because we are a Christian radio for non-Christians. Our audience, first of all, is non-believers.
So you're very evangelistic.
Very evangelistic.
What are the topics that you would talk about, for instance?
Well, we just did a study to see which topics are the most popular ones, and family by far is the most popular topic. And we now have a block of programs during the day when we talk about families and about relationships, how to raise children. There are very few materials in Russia, serious, good, helpful materials that help people actually build families, not destroy them. And we are providing that help, and it is so easy when you talk about relationships to turn the conversation to spiritual issues.
It's been a couple of years since you hosted us in Moscow, and I got to visit the studios there. But the radio station that reaches Moscow and the one in St. Petersburg, they actually go far beyond the cities, don't they? Don't you reach the rest of the country as well through cable television?
Yeah, definitely. We have cable television, we have satellite, and we have internet. And we are developing internet and now smartphones. We created applications for smartphones.
So
and
practically
many people,
anywhere in Russia you can tune in to FEBC?
Anywhere, and practical for free. I just done it in Ukraine, in Russia, in small villages, anywhere. In Latvia, I was there, and you push a button and you can hear FEBC loud and clear. And new technologies are bringing us those opportunities, and we are using them as much as possible.
I love it.
I remember I was talking to Dr. Bowman, who was one of the founders of FEBC, and he said, Victor, during those early days when we started in the 1940s, he said people would come up to me and say, you don't use that devil's box, radio.
Right.
Radio.
And the devil is the prince of the power of the air, the Bible says.
There you go, yeah. But in the same way, we are using internet today to reach many young people for Christ.
So exciting. And who are the broadcasters involved? Where do you find them? How do you develop them and their talent?
Well, of course, when we started, we did not have anybody who would have any kind of experience, and we still don't have that many people who understand media, who understand how radio works. But now we have a wonderful group of people. People like one of them you met, Eugene. He's a psychologist. He's a former KGB officer. In the
imagine
army.
that a former KGB officer who's now doing a radio program. Yeah. To convince people to become believers.
Yeah, and he does a wonderful job. He's
the most energetic person I've met, I think.
That's true, yeah. And it is interesting how God is using his program. He's all about, doing a morning show, having fun, and then somebody calls and opens up to him, and he's able to counsel them and bring many of them to Christ. In Russia, throughout Russia, and now in Kyrgyzstan and in Ukraine, it is amazing to see how God is using our simple efforts to bring people to Christ. There is still a great hunger for truth and for real relationship with God.
What are the challenges to having radio ministry in these countries?
Well, of course, political situation is very difficult. They are trying to close our station in St. Petersburg, and it is only by the prayer of our supporters and our listeners. It is by those prayers that we are still broadcasting. We don't know for how long we'll be able to do that. And but at the same time, we feel this kind of persecution, this pressure. At the same time, we just opened a station in Central Russia. So God is able to do miracles, and he is doing those miracles, but overall the situation in Russia is becoming more and more difficult politically for evangelicals in general. And we are trying to do everything we can not to offend anybody, but just to share Christ with people. And it feels like the window of opportunity is closing, but we don't want to believe that. We want to believe that we'll be able to reach a lot more people for Christ.
This conversation with Victor took place just before stringent new legal restrictions were placed on missionary and gospel activity in the country of Russia. Another event was the revocation of licenses for FEBC's AM stations in Moscow and St. Petersburg. However, through God's guidance and wise planning, FEBC has been able to switch its emphasis in Russia to the Internet, where many are listening with smartphones. In Ukraine and other former Soviet countries, both the Internet and radio stations continue to be used in proclaiming the gospel. Please pray for these efforts and for FEBC staff made up of local broadcasters who know the languages involved. For more, please visit firstpersoninterview.com, where we'll provide additional links. Also, click on the FEBC banner for more information. That's firstpersoninterview.com. My thanks to the Far East Broadcasting Company for their support of First Person. Next week, we'll talk with Michael Card. Now, with thanks to my friend and producer Joe Carlson, I'm Wayne Shepherd, inviting you back next time for First Person.